One of my favorite comfort foods is cabbage rolls, but sometimes I just don't have the time. So today I'm showing you my go-to faster version of cabbage rolls, which is unrolled cabbage soup. This one is cheap and ridiculously easy, coming together at about $3.50 a serving, and it can be on your table in about an hour. My cabbage roll soup will give you the traditional flavors of cabbage rolls, but there's a special ingredient that really brings it over the top. Let's get going. Hello there, welcome to my kitchen. You know cabbage rolls, those delightful little meaty umami rolls covered in tomato sauce that are baked in the oven? This is a similar version to that, but it's all unrolled and it comes together all on your stovetop. I saw this recipe first on Jort's Kitchen and I'll copy the link below, though there are 100 different recipes for this flying around the internet. But I wanted to take that recipe and make it a little bit better. For my taste, for a meal like this, we can build on that Jort's Kitchen original recipe and bump it up kind of at every step to make a more flavorful, more satisfying, more hearty version of unrolled cabbage soup. So I'll take you through the changes that I'm making for my version of this soup, but my soup also has a special ingredient. Sauerkraut. We're gonna add some sauerkraut both to the soup while it's cooking, but we're also gonna top the soup with a little bit of sauerkraut. I find that sauerkraut adds a nice little acidic flavor that you just can't get with a regular head of cabbage. The method here is dump and go, and this one for me can come together in like 15 minutes. It does benefit from a longer cooking time, and it'll take a little bit of time to make sure the rice is cooked. So if you have an hour between now and when dinner needs to be on the table, this recipe will work perfectly for you. Only special tool that I have is a large stock pot that I'm going to cook the soup in over on my stove. And all I've got to do is a tiny little bit of chopping before we move over to the stove. First, have to chop up an onion. So this is just one large sweet onion that I'm gonna dice. Any type of onion will work great here. You could even use a red onion. Just gonna move that off to the side. Next, a cabbage. Green cabbage will work, red cabbage will work. You can even buy the shredded cabbage already in a bag, but I'm gonna show you how I break down a cabbage. So I've just rinsed the outside of it off. Cabbage has this core on the bottom, so I like to cut it into quarters. And I use a really big knife to do this, a cleaver style knife. This is actually called the cabbage killer. It's purpose built to break down cabbage, but I just cut through the top into 2 halves. Flip it on its stable base, cut it into quarters. Then when you cut it into quarters, you can see the woody core. We don't want to eat that. So I just cut it on an angle, cut the core out, move that to the side. Once the core is cut out, I just take a look at the leaves and see if there's any schmutz on the leaves. I did pull off the outside leaf, but sometimes this cutting the cabbage exposes leaves that you don't want to eat. That looks all pretty good. And then I'm just gonna shred this cabbage. So keep in mind it's going into a soup. So we don't want big, long, stringy pieces of cabbage necessarily. I find that quarters is about the perfect size if I shred them really narrowly. So I just run my knife down through. Have a big boatload of cabbage. This is going to cook down quite a bit, and you can use less than this if you like, but one of the things that bulks up my version of this soup is a whole boatload of cabbage. So I'll probably use most of it, or as much as I can fit in the pan. Everything else for this soup comes together over at the stove, so I'll show you our setup over there and we're going to get cooking. So with a couple tablespoons of olive oil in a stock pot over a high heat, I'm gonna first brown our ground beef. So there are a few improvements that I make to the original recipe that I saw. Too frequently, I see folks building soups and stews and not taking advantage of adding flavor at every step. The original recipe that I saw this in, the meat was added with the onions, and almost immediately after, all of the spices were added. That's losing a lot of flavor. So I'm just gonna kind of press this meat into the bottom of this stock pot and leave it. Browning this beef adds a ton of additional flavor to this soup, and that's the way you make a quick cooking soup like this better. You take every opportunity that you have to add flavor, and this is the first step. Okay, it's about 90 seconds later. We've got some really good browning on that beef. This is exactly what you want. So we're just gonna flip it and leave it. I'm gonna turn it down just a little, makes cleanup easier on my stove, but I want the other side to get just as dark as that side. Okay, so we've taken the time to really brown our ground beef. It's dark, some of it's even crispy. It's nice and broken up. Next, I'm gonna add our onion. The onion's gonna go in and sweat out until it's translucent. This will probably take 5 to 7 minutes. Okay, it's about 5 minutes later, and our onions are translucent. This is a non-stick pot, but if it weren't, I'd be constantly scraping up the bottom of the pan to get any brown bits off the bottom. We absolutely want those to come up in this broth. And at this point, you could add a couple tablespoons of your broth to get them to kind of deglaze the pan and scrape up the brown bits, but you see when I stir that I don't have anything sticking to the bottom of the pan. I also don't have much oil left, so the next way I'm gonna add a ton of flavor is to put a little bit of oil right in the center, turn it down just a little bit, and then I'm gonna add our spices. So this is paprika, garlic, oregano, and basil. Put them right in the center there. And do the step called blooming the spices. You're not trying to burn them, so if your skillet is too hot, turn it down a little bit. But you're kind of trying to fry them a little bit. Adding heat to these spices really opens them up and makes them even more flavorful. So instead of just dumping them in with the rest of the liquids, add them at this point and kind of stir fry them a little bit. So I try to get them all coated in oil, and once they're coated in oil and starting to get fragrant, I stir them in with the rest of the mixture. And this is gonna cook for a couple minutes, just like this, so that those spices continue to bloom. Okay, it's about 60 seconds later. The spices are super fragrant. I can smell them looking delightful. I'm gonna add the tomato paste at this point. Add about 2 tablespoons of tomato paste directly to the hot pan. And stir that a little bit, kind of cook it a little bit. And stir it in. Tomato paste is optional here, but it does make the flavor a little bit deeper. Okay, now we're gonna start adding some of our liquids. So I still have garlic on the bench in front of me, but I don't wanna add that yet. This is super, super hot, and I've been cooking it mostly on high heat, and garlic has a tendency to burn. So I'm gonna add the garlic when I add in the tomatoes and the broth. First goes in, lower the heat a little. Tomatoes really have a tendency to sputter. 2 28-ounce cans of tomatoes. Give those a quick stir. I'll rinse these cans out. There's still a lot of good flavor in these cans, so I'm just gonna put a little water in them. And next we're gonna add the remainder of our seasoning. So a whole boatload of garlic, that's several cloves of garlic. Stir that in. A couple tablespoons of brown sugar. This soup really needs something kind of sweet to balance it. So just a couple tablespoons of brown sugar or a couple grated carrots will work perfectly too. Next is a couple tablespoons, about 1/4 cup, which is 4 tablespoons of Worcestershire sauce. 2, 3, 4. Keep in mind this is like 8 servings of soup, so lots of soup for all these seasonings. We've added no salt and pepper, so I'm gonna add some salt and pepper. So I'm tasting for seasonings, acknowledging that I am gonna add some cabbage, some beef stock, and some sauerkraut. So if it's not quite salty enough yet, that's exactly where we want it to be. It's perfect. A little bit of tart from the tomatoes, a little bit sweet from that brown sugar. You can taste all of the spices. So now we're bringing this up to temperature, and I'm gonna add beef stock. So this is about 8 cups of beef stock, actually better than bouillon. And I may or may not add all of this. I wanna make sure I can get all of the cabbage in my stock pot and have room for the rice as well. So I'm just gonna top up our tomatoey base with a few cups of that. Stir it around. And at this point, I'm gonna add in the cabbage before I add any more beef stock. Can crank the heat back up on this. And again, you don't have to add the full head of cabbage, but I like to try to do that because it cooks down quite a bit and it just bulks this soup up really nicely. So it's probably like 5 or 6 cups of cabbage. Now I'm just gonna stir this in. Okay, we do have plenty of room for the remaining stock. So all 8 cups are gonna go in. And then next up, I'm gonna add my secret ingredient. I love adding sauerkraut to the soup. It adds a nice, salty, briny, tangy flavor in the background. And I add, estimated about 1 cup to 1.5 cups. You can add less if you like, or you can add more. And I'm not necessarily trying to get any of that brine, though you can. Just be careful of the salt level. If it's a super salty brine, be sure that you're adjusting seasonings after you add the sauerkraut instead of before. Okay, so just stir that sauerkraut in. We're gonna top the soup with a little bit of sauerkraut too. And the last ingredient is a cup of rice. You can absolutely add more rice to this if you're serving more people or want to bulk it up a little bit. You'll just need to monitor how much broth you have, because you want it to be on the stewy side of soup, but still you want it to be soupy. Okay, so last step, add the rice in. Give that a stir. And then I'm gonna turn the heat down to between medium and low and let this simmer on my stove for probably the next 45 minutes to an hour. It's ready to go once the rice is cooked, but the longer it cooks, the more that cabbage breaks down, the more the flavors infuse, the better this soup gets. It's great for leftovers. Pop a lid on, and I'll see you in an hour. It's about an hour later, the rice is all cooked and our soup is done. Time to taste it. It is screaming hot, but I'm gonna ladle some up anyway. So I've topped our soup with a little bit of parsley and a nice little pile of sauerkraut, which is totally optional if you have sauerkraut haters in your house. First, I'm sorry, and second, you can just leave it off. But it does add a nice little salty kind of umami to the soup to finish, and it's time to taste. The first thing that strikes me about the soup is how well balanced it is. It's kind of everything I love in a soup. So these ingredients are really humble, but the lesson here on these quick cooking, one pot, cheap and easy meals is that you want to take every opportunity that you can to add flavor. And for like $3.50 a serving and really minimal time and effort, this one is absolutely one that I would encourage you to add to your repertoire, or at least give it a try. Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. If you like this video, give it a like. If you want to see more, please stick around, subscribe to the channel. I would love to have you, and I look forward to seeing you here next time. Cheers.